I'm going to attempt to make more clear an important point concerning the root origin of all of these large scale problems that we're observing. So, I'm talking to someone who sees these as problems in the first place. So, for example, medical tyranny. If that's something you don't like, then, continue to listen. Otherwise, you don't even see the large scale issue as a problem. So, you're not going to probably care about its origin or what it looks like on a smaller scale, right? If you're not even bothered by the large scale. Speaking of the medical tyranny, right? The United Nations, the World Health Organization, is pushing this like World Health Pandemic Treaty or something along those lines, pandemic ordinance or you know program for the entire world, right? And they're having a vote, I believe, coming up in 2024 that's going to give them this extreme power to basically carry out medical tyranny. And even, the leaders of independent countries are not going to be able to opt out, right? So the United Nations is doing to governments what governments have been doing to the individuals, right? So this gets to the important ethics that, again, I know can seem like not that important, but or kind of irrelevant or not. Maybe you don't think it's irrelevant, but you think like it doesn't have any teeth to it. Like it's a nice discussion kind of thing, but what are we gonna do about this problem? We gotta, write our representatives and tell them to reject the pandemic treaty. We gotta tell them to stop, you know, pushing medical tyranny and basically, working for big pharma. And so this kind of activism is seen as the the more practical and needed thing to do. We can keep, the ethics is good and all, but we need to take action, right? So I think a lot of folks have a mindset like that based on what I've seen, and I understand that mindset. I used to be more uh, like-minded in that way. I used to think that way much more. But the problem with that is you're missing a fundamental mistake as far as ethics on a social level that is allowing for all this to happen. And as long as that's ignored, it's just going to keep happening. So it really is that crucial. It's like if you have some kind of sickness, keep treating the symptoms, but you never, get the cure, then it's just going to keep coming back, right? So we can observe it in the human body and we can observe it in the social body as well. And so, again, the key ethical understanding that you have to have is that abuse is wrong in all circumstances, anytime. It doesn't matter if there's an emergency, it doesn't matter if there's a natural disaster. Abuse is always evil, right? So that needs to be held on to, because if you think there are exceptions to the rule, what happens is those exceptions are just going to be utilized over and over again by people that want to carry out abuse, right? So, recent news, the New Mexico governor, right, declared an emergency, right? So she suspended the Second Amendment, right, making the people of that region defenseless, right, in the name of safety, of course. So it comes back to some core principles, but a couple in particular that really need to be understood, and that's, again, abuse is wrong in all circumstances and done by anyone. And this idea that you can attack someone first in the name of safety. You can do something abusive as long as you say the word safety, as long as you declare an emergency. That's not ethically legitimate, and it's not complicated. Like, it's common sense ethics, right? You wouldn't accept that from a neighbor. You wouldn't accept a neighbor pushing drugs on you or disarming you or doing anything else abusive just because they said it was for safety, right? So then this comes back to the appeal to authority, this delusional mindset where you put your normal common sense ethics aside and think, oh, well, it's okay when they do it. Or when they do it, it's not even abusive anymore. It's just helping society, right? So this is the fundamental blunder that just keeps being played over and over and over again. Abuses that are recognized on the person to person level, neighbor to neighbor level, are seen to not be abusive when they're done by people in positions of power, which is just ridiculous. It's just delusional. And then additionally, not recognizing that when you give people those positions of power, it corrupts them, right? And additionally, people that are abusively minded and have tendencies to be abusive are going to be attracted to those positions of power because it gives them a free pass to carry out that behavior and allows them to do it on a larger scale, right? Like narcissistic abuse, one of the key things about those toxic relationships that folks will point out is that they are often covert about it, right? They want to get away with it. They don't want to be exposed, right? Well, what better position for these folks to be offered than, political power and all these other positions of power where they can have their abuse legitimized. And again, I'm not just throwing my own like subjective perspective on what abuse is. I'm saying, again, this is what is recognized as criminal between two so-called normal people. This isn't like my opinion, right? It is criminal for one person to commit extortion against another person, right? An ordinary person to do that to another ordinary person. It is criminal for someone to coerce someone else to take your favorite cocktail of drugs, right? Yes. So it is criminal to disarm a nonviolent person, right? You can't just go to someone's house and take guns and knives just because you want to feel safer, right? That's not legitimate, right? It would be considered criminal, it would be considered theft, right? Because you're committing an abuse against someone who hasn't done anything abusive, right? Basic ethics. You're just recognizing that abuse is never acceptable, and the only kind of force that is appropriate is defensive force that's proportional to the abuse, Like I said in a previous talk, Jesus actually said, if someone strikes you on the jaw, return to them one of the same kind likewise. He didn't say turn the other cheek. The, the words were mistranslated on purpose to serve this pro empire, pro abusive system that, we're born into. So, what's interesting about this pandemic treaty is that you have politicians from various governments, some of them speaking out saying, hey, we're losing our sovereignty. If we let them have this power, they're going to be able to just impose all these drugs and medical devices and surveillance and travel restrictions and on and on and on anytime they want to, basically. Anytime they say the word emergency, they basically get to control our country, right? So it's the same objection that an individual was making, to the so-called, independent governments um, during these previous lockdowns, right? They're telling me what needs to go in my body and on my body. They're restricting my travel, all in the name of safety and disregarding my personal sovereignty. But people are just really naive in that they think, well, we need to do something. And then they think, well, of course, these people in these positions of power are the ideal people to do that something. Like, why do you make that assumption? Based on what? Like, do they have a great track record? Are people not corrupted by power? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Why would you look to people in positions of power that are based on abuse and that corrupt them so that they want to even become even more powerful? After they get to the top of that pyramid, they want to go even higher, right? Because they're corrupted. So it's always this desire to get even more power. So then where do they go? Well, then they can go to the United Nations, right? Because then they can be even further up the pyramid, right? They can add levels. There used to be a capstone to the pyramid in, of some kind, and then they make the pyramid even larger. Okay, now we have the United Nations. Now we have the World Health Organization. Now we have these international organizations. So now we can have even more power. And so they betray those below them and seek to go even higher, right? So the way that they're able to do that, though, is still based on the same ethics, and that's the false ethics. And that's why they keep saying safety 100 times a day. So, if you don't think the ethics are important, you're mistaken, and um, it can be pointed out how it is actually important because they keep talking about it as if it's the justification for what they're doing, right? They keep talking about safety, right? And so what does that mean? That means that they're saying what we're doing is ethically justified, right? As long as I keep saying the word safety, then whatever I do, whatever totalitarianism I do that just makes the world increasingly unfree, increasingly lame, increasingly communist, as long as I say it's for safety, it's okay. As long as I say I've saved some lives, well, then it's all right. And the reason why they get away with that is because, again, people are not recognizing that preemptive attack is not legitimate. So, yeah, number one, preemptive attack is not legitimate, right? Number two, you could say preemptive attack is a form of. Number three, abuse is always evil. Number four, therefore, preemptive attack is evil always, right? It's this simple understanding that would prevent these positions of power from being created in the first place and then continuously getting worse because of the corrupting nature of those positions. So the only way out of this is to recognize that we need the complete opposite of what they're pushing, right? They want total control of people on a global level. Well, the answer is they want to completely abolish sovereignty altogether of even the countries, even the individual governments. They want to say, oh, they're not even sovereign. It's similar with the United States, right? We had the 13 colonies, and then the federal government came in and basically abolished their sovereignty. That's actually more what the Civil War was about, was forcing those that had seceded back into the Union than it was about slavery. But I have a whole playlist on Civil War truth in case you're interested on that. But the point here that I'm just trying to really hammer in to make clear is all of this would be prevented if if it would be accepted that there's no exceptions to the non-abuse rule. So therefore, extortion isn't acceptable. All of these totalitarian measures, medical tyranny, all these um, restrictions on on travel, and even like what vehicles you can use to travel. Again, there you're just saying it's for safety. Oh, now you can no longer use vehicles with internal combustion engines. You need to only have electric, which we just so happen to be able to control remotely. Be able to turn off if you don't follow our rules. None of that would be acceptable. If we were just free people on the planet again, you wouldn't be able to go to your neighbor and be like, "Oh, I don't like, this vehicle that you're driving. You need to conform to my my rules. And so I know what like an environmentalist minded person is going to say. We're going to say, well, but there is environmental damage, and we do need to have some kind of protections against that. That's true. The world has become extremely toxic, and that is not a good thing. Things like cancer and autism just become commonplace, and they're becoming so common it's just completely insane that it's being accepted as like a normal. But the thing is, you have to recognize, well, what is the best remedy? Is the best remedy giving some people the free pass to be abusive and extort money from us all the time and do with it whatever they want and just hope for the best? No, that isn't the best way to handle these problems. That actually, it makes things worse, you know? So even if they're saying that they're doing this to save the planet and save everyone's health, they're not trustworthy. And it's, the hypocrisy runs deep. All of the adverse reactions are completely ignored, right? All their support, actually, of making the world a more toxic place um, is ignored. So it comes back to this idol worship of thinking like, well, they're the only ones. It's only the extortionists that can make the world a better place, rather than starting, on a local level, localizing and privatizing everything, and working within your own communities to make things more non-toxic, healthier, more free, and giving people access to a little bit of land and water and seed would be a great start too. It's actually crucial for that positive transformation to happen, because otherwise people are still in a state of economic instability and dependence, and so they're still subject to a system of unnatural power that has a corrupting nature. And when you add politics on top of it, saying, oh, you can do all these abusive things as long as you say it's for safety, and you can commit extortion 24 hours a day, taxing us left and right, as long as you say it's going to be used for some good things. Why is that seen as the superior option? It's just clearly not. Like, the socialist mindset is just really dumb, and a lot of times they'll point to, oh, well, look at how they use the tax dollars in this country. Like, oh, they distribute it, and then they have a lockdown, right? And then they force um, drugs on everybody, right? And everybody's disarmed and basically turned into cattle. Oh, but they have this great healthcare program, supposedly, right? It's just this naive belief that whoever is in these positions of unnatural power is going to do the best thing with the money that they took from you forcefully, and to let them do abusive acts, let them carry out preemptive attack. Right? The idea that you can push medical devices and drugs on people just because you say it's for safety, that wouldn't fly on the individual to individual level. So it just shows that it's really this slave think mentality where people think, well, yeah, it wouldn't be okay for us to do it. We're just lowly citizens, but it's okay for them to do it. And it just doesn't make sense either, because so many people actually don't. If you go on the street and do a survey, like, oh, do you think politicians are like the most um, morally upright and excellent people on the planet? Like, most people are probably gonna say no. So then, it's like the Stockholm syndrome, weird contradiction, like walking contradiction, where they don't think these people are necessarily great or trustworthy, but they think somehow the system is the way to go, even though the system is fundamentally unethical, right? Based on extortion. So, how about we just promote health in our communities, promote security, fire prevention, etc., all the things, medical care, schooling. How about we have all that without the corrupted, institutionalized versions of them, right? Which give us these crappy quality, especially as you go up the pyramid. It's always these like federal policies coming down the pyramid that push all this garbage into schools and put all these protocols in place in hospitals that actually end up harming a lot of people, especially infants, and turning people away from nutrition and other natural alternatives that would actually be even more beneficial, right? So, again, actually stating that preemptive attack is never legitimate, actually stating that abusive control is never acceptable under any circumstance, no emergency makes it okay. Recognizing it's just like a solid, eternal moral law. And that's because it is, because it's just another way of communicating the greatest commandments of Jesus, which is comprehensive love towards God, others, and yourself. And the opposite of the verb love, the befriending action, is abusive action. So it's eternally unacceptable. And again, it's not like hard to grasp. Well, what counts? Well, initiating violence, right? That's universally understood by sane people to be a bad thing, right? Like we don't like it if one neighbor does that to another, right? Being deceptive for lying for selfish purposes, that's also universally accepted as not a good thing, right? And stealing, right? Aggression, stealing, and deception, these are all abusive actions. And so thinking that letting these people with this immense power do these things just because they say it's for the greater good is just a huge, huge blunder. And so now we have just this further concentration of centralized power into the hands of the United Nations. And it all started because the individual lost it, right? The individual gave it to the state gave it to the federal government gave it to the United Nations, right? It's an it's in an inevitable corrupting train of movement that will always, once you set up those tracks, that's just the way it's going to go every time because of the corrupting nature of power and because you've said abuse is sometimes okay. So people that were already abusively minded again are going to be attracted to those positions, and then once they get on there, then get in those positions, then they just go even crazier with that because they then become corrupted by the power that you just gave them. Again, this is observable with governments that after they disarm a population that they end up being even crazier and more violent because they get further corrupted by that huge increase in power they gain by having a monopoly on firearms and being able to do whatever they want to hundreds of millions of people. So again, the root of it is not respecting the sovereignty of the individual and not recognizing that abuse is always evil and preemptive attack is just a form of abuse. And setting up a system of abuse based on extortion, which is an act of abuse, is just inevitably going to turn out badly. Patrick Henry was against the new constitutional convention that was put in place because he saw this is just a coup where they're going to set up this federal centralized government that's going to override the sovereignty of the states and the people, and it's just going to become another tyranny like we were fighting against with the British Empire. And he was exactly right. And it happened soon thereafter. Right in the 1790s, you had the Whiskey Rebellion. You had folks rebelling against the new unfair taxation. And then what did George Washington do? He just used his federal power to gather the troops and squash the rebellion, right? And then it just kept marching forward from there. On to 1913, institute the income tax, put in the central bank. More and more centralized power and control. It just gets worse and worse. So the answer again is recognize people as sovereign individuals, embracing the non-abuse principle, and also establishing space for people to have economic stability and individual autonomy through having access to homesteading land, water, and seed. Right? If you don't have any sovereign space on the planet, well, then you're in some collectivist scheme that undoubtedly is legitimizing abuse on some level, right? Because it's denying you your right to control your own body, make your own decisions, have your own privacy, right? Have some independence. It's independence versus totalitarianism, right? So rather than thinking, oh, we can just go back a little more independent and then everything's going to be fine, it's just like pushing the rock up the hill a few feet and then it's just inevitably gonna roll right back. It's just like a natural. It's like the law of gravity. It's like the second law of thermodynamics. It's just inevitable that the corruption is just gonna push for more centralization of power, more supposedly legitimized abuse, less sovereignty of the individual. Abuse is always unacceptable. Aggression, deception, and theft are forms of abuse. Preemptive attack is always an act of aggression. You're initiating violence. It's not justifiable just because someone says safety that they can carry out this abuse of control. That it needs to be rejected on that level. If you go at it any other way, if you say, "Oh well, there's this law," if you're just appealing to lower down on the pyramid of the system and thinking like that's going to be the cure, it's not, because you're just ignoring that it was the structure of the system in the first place that allowed this to happen, and it'll just go right back to that further concentration of abusive power once it's given the chance to.